Me again. So, we have covered the fundamentals of applied research, motivated by looking at CCIs and at how they help us develop theories of change and logic models. And then we looked at those theories and models in some detail. And now I want to look at how we would actually use these things in our applied research. So, in basic research, you will develop a theory that produces hypotheses relating key concepts to one another. In applied research, you do the same thing. And sometimes it looks exactly the way that it did last week. But sometimes, if, for example, you're using a theory of change and building a logic model, sometimes it might be slightly different. Here, your hypotheses take a form like, if X program succeeds, we expect to see Y. Or as X program grows bigger, we expect to see increases or decreases in Y, or whatever. The X's, your independent variables, these are your activities or programs or interventions. And the Y's, the dependent variables, these are called benchmarks. I tend to think of benchmarks as interchangeable with indicators because I'm a basic researcher, and they really are the same thing. Benchmarks are the observable, measurable versions of things we are trying to study. They are operationalized concepts. So when you build a theory of change, for each activity or program or intervention, you want to consider possible benchmarks. We touched on these already in one of the earlier mini lectures where I called them outputs, and we talked about short, medium, and long-term outputs. Now we're going to think about those as benchmarks. So for each thing you want to introduce, you have to consider the possible observable consequences of putting that thing in motion. And for each outcome you want to achieve, you have to consider the possible observable indicators that will help you look at the thing and say, that's working well, or that needs to work better, or whatever. Benchmarks are measures of progress, and we find them and we use them all over the place. So in the logic model on this slide, you see an example of a program that was designed to increase voter turnout and, in increasing voter turnout, or by extension, improve American democracy. The underlying assumption here is that the more citizens vote, the more thriving our democracy is. The idea is that turnout can be improved by a simple bipartisan reminder in advance of the election. So the program here, or the concept here, is you want to increase turnout, just remind people ahead of the election to vote. What we'd be interested in measuring here is the short-term outcome column. And when we look at the short-term outcome column, we see three different things that we can benchmark. First, there's a reminder, which then enhances the intent to vote. That intent to vote leads to our second benchmark, which is the plan to go vote. And then the third benchmark is the actual casting of a ballot. Here are three observable things that would actually happen if this worked. Here are three benchmarks. Now, measuring the casting of a ballot is pretty straightforward. Did you vote or not? And it's measured, right? But imagine we wanted to measure the impact on intent. So imagine instead of saying, did this reminder increase turnout, we wanted to look at the benchmark. Did this reminder increase intent to vote? That requires a bit more creativity than just measuring whether or not voting happened, right? But it's certainly doable. For example, if you want to measure voters would-be voters' intent to vote, you could call the people who got the reminder and call people who didn't and straight up ask, do you intend to vote or not? And then compare the set who got the reminder to the set that didn't and see if there's a statistically significant difference. By the way, we could also measure any other kind of planning in that way. So there's your short-term outcome and its benchmarks. Now let's look at the intermediate outcome. If we were going to measure voting as habitual, if we wanted to see whether reminders to vote increase turnout, not just in this election, but habitually in a way that makes American democracy healthier, then we would look at turnout for the same people over the course of multiple elections, and that would become our benchmark. If you want to measure habitual voting, your benchmark is, did you vote in some number of elections in a row? right? Did you vote enough that it became a habit? Here's my point. Okay. A logic model with clear benchmarks will serve as a roadmap for helping us understand what to measure, from whom, and when. It helps us understand what to make happen and how and why. And I should point out, this is almost exactly the same thing that hypotheses did in last week's material. Together, all of these things help us figure out what to measure, when to measure it, and in some cases, they actually provide insights about how to measure them, such as this idea about measuring intent. The utility of this approach is really twofold, so there's two big benefits to doing this. First, it helps address causality in circumstances where causality is often difficult, if not impossible, to establish. It can be hard to establish the effect of a reminder as increasing intent to vote unless you can measure intent, and here's a way to do it. The second thing, though, is that it helps you as a researcher articulate from the planning phase of the research what the intervention actually is and how it is, in theory, supposed to work. Right? Knowing what these benchmarks are help you articulate from the beginning of your research what should be happening if this is working well. That said, there are also several limitations. I don't want you to think that logic models and theories of change are the silver bullet or a perfect solution to everything. And so, as in every type of research, I want you to be aware of the weaknesses as well. The first thing is that logic models capture intent, not what actually happens. They capture what a planned program is meant to do or intended to do. If the planned program and the actual program as it gets put in place are meaningfully different, then the benchmarks we've developed may be less useful. The second potential drawback is that logic models can simplify complex factors too much. Like, they're great because they cut out a lot of noise, but sometimes you might accidentally cut out important pieces along with the excess noise that you don't need. And then the third possible drawback to logic models and theories of change is that when you use them for planning purposes, if you follow them exactly, they can be really inflexible in a way that unnecessarily and undesirably stifles creativity and spontaneity. If you're too locked into a plan, you lack flexibility. That's true in life too, right? If you're too fixed on what you plan to do and things come along so that it would be better if you changed a little bit, if you're too locked in and you don't change, that can have negative consequences. Sometimes if you don't bend, you break. And if you follow logic models too exactly and you get pushed, if you don't bend, you break. What did I say? 4 drawbacks. The fourth one is that when you use them to evaluate a program, some people think that logic models are problematic because they're focused solely on positive outcomes. The claim is that evaluators may, as a result, overlook negative outcomes as well as any unintended consequences, positive or negative. So if your benchmarks are all, here are the positive things that are going to happen if this works well, you're not looking for bad things that happen if it works well. And you're not looking for things we didn't expect that are happening off on the sides anyway. And so because you're focused solely on getting positive outcomes, it can cause you to just turn a blind eye to, unintentionally, and with the best of intentions, unintentionally and with good meaning, it can cause you to overlook bad stuff that's happening over here as a result of what you did. All right, so these are just not reasons not to use these models, just things to be aware of. I think that's all I've got on logic models for today. You'll see them again in your practice assignment. Bring your questions on Friday as always, and I will see you then.